The first time Jesus stepped into the gleaming lobby of Myri Group's headquarters, the receptionist barely looked up. She had a mop in her hand, not because she was cleaning, but because the building's actual janitor had dropped it in panic during a fire drill, and she had picked it up while helping guide a pregnant employee outside. No one cared to ask why. She wore plain flats, jeans and a neutral beige cardigan, her long hair tied back into a low ponytail, no makeup. To the sharply dressed assistants, she was invisible. To the interns buzzing around with iced Americanos and printed spreadsheets, she was just one of the dozens of unseen staff moving through the polished floors of corporate Seoul. She didn't bother correcting them. "Excuse me, cleaning lady," one of the younger receptionists called out, pointing at a coffee spill near the elevator. Haesa looked at the floor, then at the girl, and simply nodded. She didn't mind wiping up the spill. It wasn't beneath her. She didn't care that a senior manager passed her without a second glance, or that an intern whispered behind his hand, laughing that she looked like someone's aunt who wandered into the wrong building. She didn't say a word. She had no reason to. Because 2 floors above them, in a secured executive office with glass walls and a nameplate that made board members straighten their backs, her husband, CEO Cha Min-jae, was in a strategy meeting about market expansion. And if he knew she was here, wiping floors with someone else's mop, he'd cancel half his schedule and come downstairs with fire in his eyes. But she didn't want that. Their marriage wasn't a secret out of shame, it was a condition. A quiet understanding. 6 months ago, they signed a contract in a private room with no photographers, no flowers, no media. Just a witness, 2 signatures, and a very expensive ring. It was supposed to be temporary. A merger of reputations, a counterweight against a hostile takeover, and a calculated move to calm both their families. The plan had always been to keep it private. Haesa didn't ask for love. She asked for stability, for herself and her 6-year-old daughter, Sumin. In return, Min-jae asked for silence. Public appearances were off the table. She would not be introduced at company functions. He would not explain her presence in his life. The fewer people who knew, the safer it was for both of them. She agreed. It was logical. Safe. Controlled. But no amount of control prepared her for how the office would treat her today. She had only come to drop off Minji's medication. He had forgotten it again, something for the migraines he always pretended not to have. She carried it in her bag, along with a small lunch she'd packed because she knew he wouldn't eat otherwise. The receptionist didn't let her up. "Only employees past the 20th floor, sorry," she said, not even bothering to hide the annoyance in her voice. "Try the service entrance." So Haesu waited in the employee lounge near the back elevators. Her phone had no signal. The Wi-Fi required credentials. She sat on a bench meant for cleaning staff and delivery workers, ignored by everyone who passed by. At one point, an older woman in a maid uniform sat beside her and offered a rice ball. They shared a few words about knee pain and stubborn bosses. That was the only human interaction Haesu had that morning. At 12:17 p.m., the elevator doors opened with a soft chime. 2 junior managers stepped out, laughing loudly. One of them pointed at Haesu. "She's still here? Must be on break, huh? Wish I could nap at work." "She probably doesn't even speak Korean," the other joked. "Probably one of those foreign wives. Or divorced. You know how they end up in jobs like this." Haesu didn't flinch. She just tightened her grip on the small bag in her lap and focused on her breathing. Then came the girl in red heels. Kang Nari, executive assistant to the vice director. She looked barely out of university, but she walked like she owned the building. When she spotted Haesu, her lips curled into a smirk. "Ah, I remember you. You were here last week too, right? Wandering around like you belonged here?" Haesu looked up. "I was just." "I don't care," Nari interrupted, glancing around to see if anyone else was watching. "This is a workplace, not a daycare for washed-up women. If you're done cleaning, get out. We don't need loiterers making clients uncomfortable." The words weren't loud, but they were sharp enough to cut. A few heads turned. "I'm waiting for someone," Haesu replied, voice quiet but calm. "Then wait outside. Better yet, wait at home. You don't belong here." And just like that, the girl turned and walked off, heels clicking like a judge's gavel. Haesu exhaled slowly. She stood, adjusted the strap on her bag and walked toward the side staircase. She didn't need to climb up. She just needed air. On the 15th floor, through a security door left ajar by a delivery man, she found a small terrace. It was barely wider than a hallway, lined with planters full of wilting succulents and cigarette butts. She leaned on the railing, opened the bag and pulled out Minji's medicine. She stared at the skyline. The city moved like nothing could slow it down. Then, behind the glass of the adjacent office window, she saw him. Cha Min-jae. He stood at his desk, sleeves rolled, tie loosened, brow furrowed as he read something on his monitor. His expression was stern, intimidating even, but to her it was familiar. It was the same look he wore when trying to figure out how to make Sumin's science project light up with LEDs. The same frown he had when he realized he liked sleeping on her side of the bed better. He hadn't seen her yet. So she raised the pill bottle, held it to the glass and smiled softly. Just for fun. Just because it was silly. Just because no one was watching. But someone was. Behind him, in the reflection of the conference room mirror, Min-jae caught the motion. He turned, saw her through the glass, and for the first time in weeks he smiled. Not just a polite nod or a courteous grin. A real smile. The kind that softened his entire face and made the cold CO facade fall away like a dropped coat. He walked straight to the door, opened the terrace and stepped out. You shouldn't be here, he said, but his voice wasn't scolding. I know, she replied. But you forgot your medicine. He took it from her hand, then glanced at the bag. And food. You skipped breakfast. There was a pause. Long enough for her to hear the buzz of fluorescent lights above them. Long enough for her to wonder if the window behind them still reflected anything. Come inside, he said. You don't need to wait in the lounge. I'll get you a visitor's pass. No, she said quickly. That's not the deal, remember? The deal, he murmured, is starting to annoy me. And for the first time since they married, Haesu realized, Min-jae didn't want the arrangement anymore. Not because it wasn't working, but because something had changed. In him. In her. In the silence between them that was no longer comfortable, but aching. Downstairs, the same receptionist laughed with a manager about the weird cleaning lady, who looked like she thought she owned the place. She did. They just didn't know it yet. The next morning, Haesu didn't go near Myri Group. She packed Sumin's lunch, walked her to the kindergarten bus stop, and returned to their modest two-bedroom apartment above a used bookstore in Mapo. The apartment was clean but unassuming. No one would ever guess the woman folding laundry in a sun-faded t-shirt was married to one of Korea's most powerful CEOs. And Haesu preferred it that way. Their marriage had always been a private negotiation, not a fairy tale. When Min-jae first proposed the arrangement, there had been no champagne, no down-on-one-knee theatrics. Just a contract printed on thick stock paper and a long conversation at a quiet cafe near the Han River. She was a single mother, struggling to make ends meet after her ex-husband left with debt collectors at his heels. He was a public figure, burdened with family obligations and a board full of shareholders who would rather see him paired off with the daughter of a conglomerate than with a former waitress. They made a deal. 3 years. Mutual support. No public disclosures. No social media. No photographs. No expectations of intimacy. And for the most part it worked. Min-jae never interfered with her personal life. He covered Sumin's tuition without being asked. He always made time for Haesu on Fridays, even if that meant sneaking in late through the back of her apartment building. In return, she kept his secrets. She didn't attend galas. She stayed off company property, unless it was an emergency like yesterday. She honored every clause in that contract down to the word. But now something had shifted. She saw it in the way he looked at her through the glass. In the softness of his voice. In that one sentence, "The deal is starting to annoy me." Min-jae was never impulsive. He didn't say things he didn't mean. So if he said that, he had been thinking it for a while. At 11:45 a.m., her phone buzzed. Min-jae, did you eat? Haesu stared at the message. They rarely texted during work hours unless something was urgent. Still, she replied, just finished. You. Min-jae, about to order. Want to come here and have lunch? That stopped her. She reread it twice. Come here. As in, to Myri Group. As in, after yesterday's disaster. He had to be joking. Haesu, I thought I was banned by the receptionist. Min-jae, I fired her. Her mouth parted in disbelief. He didn't even sugarcoat it. Haesu, that's a bit much. Min-jae, she embarrassed my wife. There's no tolerance for that. Come to the executive floor. Your pass will be ready at the front. It wasn't a suggestion. Haesu hesitated. It had only been a day since she was mistaken for a cleaner. A single day since she was told to wait at home, like a misbehaving dog. Could she really walk in there now with a pass, bypassing everyone who laughed at her? She changed into a simple navy blouse and slacks, tied her hair in a neat bun, and left the house with a deep breath. At Myri Group's front desk, the new receptionist, nervous and clearly overprepared, stood up the moment she saw Haesu. Mrs. Cha? She asked almost too loudly. I have your badge here. CO Cha said to bring you straight up. Please right this way. Within seconds, every head in the lobby turned. Some blinked in surprise. Some tried to hide the recognition. A few were clearly trying to remember if they'd ever seen this woman before. But it was Kang Nari, the red-heeled assistant from the day before, who dropped her pen. She stood, mouth slightly open. Wait, her? She's? Hesa didn't stop. She walked straight to the private elevator like she'd done it every day of her life. The doors closed behind her in silence. When she arrived on the executive floor, the change was immediate. Staff bowed. Assistants whispered respectfully. Her badge was already registered with the security doors. One tap and they opened like magic. Minji's office was at the end of the hall, surrounded by sleek glass walls and large bookshelves filled with market reports and business journals. He was waiting by the door when she arrived, holding a takeaway bag from her favorite cafe. You remembered, she said, half smiling. You skipped breakfast, he replied. I could have eaten at home. You could have. But then I wouldn't get to see you. His tone was casual, but his eyes lingered on her like he was memorizing her face. He stepped aside and motioned for her to come in. Let them talk. She raised an eyebrow. Let who talk? The people who think you're invisible. Let them talk until their throats go hoarse. You're my wife. If they're uncomfortable with that, they can leave. Asa sat on the couch near the window and opened the lunch box. It was a simple bulgogi bowl with a side of kimchi. He sat beside her, rolling his sleeves like he always did before eating. Did your father ever visit this office? She asked, half teasing. Min-jae chuckled. He hates elevators. I had to bring everything down to the ground floor when he came by. Why? Just wondering how many people mistook him for a delivery man. He paused. Someone said that to you? Not in those words. But the meaning was clear. Min-jae was silent for a beat, then reached for a pair of wooden chopsticks and passed them to her. I can't undo what they said, he said quietly. But I can change how they look at you going forward. I don't need their respect. No, he agreed. But you deserve it. Hesa didn't respond. She just kept eating, chewing slowly, thoughtfully. After a long pause, she asked, Why now? What? Why change the arrangement now? Why invite me here? Why make it public? Min-jae looked out the window, his jaw tense. Because I realized something yesterday. When I saw you standing outside that window with that stupid little smile and a bottle of pills, I wanted the whole damn floor to know who you were. I was angry. Not at you, at myself. For thinking that keeping you hidden would protect you. I was wrong. Hesa looked down. You're not the only one who signed that contract. I know. And I'm asking you to tear it up with me. He reached into the drawer behind his desk and pulled out the original copy of their agreement, still sealed in a folder. Then he placed a silver lighter on the table. Burn it, he said. Right here if you want. Or at home. But I don't want this between us anymore. She stared at the folder. It represented everything they had carefully constructed for half a year. The terms. The boundaries. The protection. Then she looked at him. Really looked at him. At the CEO everyone feared, who now sat beside her looking not like a powerful man, but like someone quietly begging not to lose something he'd only just realized mattered. I'll think about it, she said softly. But don't fire anyone else on my account. It's too much power in the wrong direction. He smirked. So you're saying I should let people disrespect my wife? I'm saying they should learn to respect people without needing to know their titles. Min-jae leaned back. You're going to ruin me, Haesu. Too late, she smiled. The elevator pinged outside. Someone was coming. Footsteps approached. Kang Nari's voice was unmistakable as she called out, Director Cha, I have the quarterly. She froze in the doorway when she saw Haesu sitting on the CEO's couch, calmly eating bulgogi, Min-jae seated beside her like it was the most normal thing in the world. Haesu glanced up. You can leave it there, she said politely. Nari's mouth opened, then closed again. She put the file down, bowed stiffly and left. Min-jae didn't even look at her. His eyes were still on Haesu. And this time no one was laughing. The moment Kang Nari exited the office, she headed straight for the HR floor. Her steps were tight with restraint, but her eyes gleamed with confusion, panic, and something closer to insult. The rest of the office had already started whispering. Word was spreading faster than wildfire. The woman they thought was some random visitor, or worse, a cleaner, was actually CEO Cha Minji's wife. Not his assistant. Not a cousin. Not a guest. His wife. Married. Legal. Private registry sealed or not, that kind of detail doesn't stay hidden forever. Especially not in a company like Myri Group, where everyone watches everyone and hierarchy feeds off curiosity. Back in the office, Min-jae leaned back in his chair as Hae-soo finished her lunch and carefully repacked the leftovers into the bag. He didn't interrupt her, just watched. It was strange how something so ordinary, packing away a container, folding a napkin, could look so grounding in a space like this. She didn't belong here, not in the way these people thought she should, but that's what made her even more real in this polished, shallow world. "You're not going to say anything about the way she looked at you?" he asked. Hae-soo zipped the lunch bag shut. "You mean the expression of someone watching the floor cave in under her heels?" He smirked. "That one. She's not the problem," she said simply. "The system you built is." Min-jae didn't argue. He had spent a decade building Myri Group's public-facing image to be sleek, elite, and untouchable. People like Kang Nari thrived in those spaces, not because they were competent but because they played the part. Flawless heels. Aggressive ambition. A polite face that could gut someone the moment they turned. Those were the people who dictated the unspoken rules, who belonged and who didn't. Hae-soo stood. "You sure me being here won't affect your leadership image?" "I think it'll improve it." That wasn't an answer. "It's the only one I'll give." She gave him a look that lingered somewhere between amused and unconvinced, but she didn't push. Instead she moved toward the door slowly. "I'll head home. I need to pick up Sumin in a couple of hours." "I'll come by later," he said. Hae-soo hesitated, then turned back. "Do you want to eat dinner at my place?" Min-jae blinked. She'd never offered that before. The invitation hung in the air, light but loaded. "I'll bring dessert," he said. She left, and for several minutes Min-jae remained seated, letting the silence of the office settle around him. Outside though, chaos brewed. On the 25th floor, Nari sat across from her colleague, Manager Kim, with her arms folded and her lips tight. "You're telling me no one in this company knew about her?" she asked sharply. Kim shook his head. Apparently only legal and the board had signed off. Quiet approval. It was never entered into the internal marital disclosure records. "She's been married to him for how long?" "Some are saying 8 months. Others think longer." Nari stared ahead, her jaw set. "She came in here like she owned the place." "She does, kind of. At least legally." Nari stood. "This changes everything. If he's married, that ruins the merger conversations with Dean Group. Their chairman's daughter has been trying to get into his circle for years. You think she's going to back out?" "She's going to go nuclear," Nari said flatly. "You don't grow up in chaebol circles without learning how to eliminate competition." Downstairs, Hae-soo stepped into the elevator, sensing the weight of the building's attention on her back. It was subtle but thick. She didn't turn around. She didn't flinch. Instead, she pressed the button for the ground floor and let the door slide shut in front of half a dozen wide-eyed staffers, all of whom now recognized her face. As the elevator descended, she could feel the shift happening. The balance of power, the way people looked at her, the math they were running in their heads, it was all starting to crumble. That would come with consequences. She hailed a taxi outside, eyes squinting into the sunlight. Her phone vibrated in her bag. It was a text from Min-jae. "Let's not hide anymore. If you're okay with it, I'll announce it at next week's press conference." She stared at the screen. Her thumb hovered over the keyboard. She could say yes and step fully into the fire, or she could tell him to pause, to wait, to protect Sumin herself, their tiny bubble of privacy. But the moment passed without her responding. She put the phone away. Back at Myri HQ, Min-jae received no reply. He wasn't surprised. Hae-soo didn't move on anyone else's timetable. Not even his. He looked out the window and watched the afternoon sun shift across the city skyline. Meanwhile, at a luxury hotel suite in Gangnam, Dean Group's heiress, Yoo poured herself a glass of imported sparkling water and stared at her assistant with a forced calm. "You're telling me," she said slowly, "that Cha Min-jae married a single mother, kept it secret for almost a year, and only now has the nerve to parade her around my father's investment?" Her assistant gulped. "She's not even from a notable family?" Dean pressed. "No ma'am. Her background is completely private. She previously worked in hospitality. Her daughter is 5 years old." Dean's lip curled. How pedestrian. The assistant didn't speak. Dean put the glass down. "Make some calls. I want everything. Where she shops. Where she eats. Who her friends are. And how she landed a man like Min-jae." "But ma'am?" "She's not staying," Dean said coldly. "I won't allow it." That same evening in Hae-soo's apartment, dinner was simple. Steamed fish, seaweed soup and seasoned vegetables. Sumin sat cross-legged on the floor, drawing a fox on a sketchpad while Min-jae folded napkins beside her. The room smelled like sesame oil and miso. Familiar. Unpretentious. Jesus stirred the pot and called over her shoulder, "Did you really fire the receptionist?" Min-jae from the floor replied, "She was warned 3 times about attitude issues. Yesterday was the last straw. So it wasn't just for me. It was mostly for you." She turned and looked at him. "That's nice. You sound surprised." "I am. I don't usually get that kind of loyalty." "You don't ask for it." He stood and stepped into the kitchen. His voice lowered. "You didn't ask for me either." Jesus kept stirring. "You made an offer. I accepted. Then let me make another." She turned slowly. "What now?" "I want to dissolve the contract. Not replace it. Not upgrade it. I want to date you. For real. Like a real couple. Let's start over." Jesus stared at him. Behind him, Sumin was humming as she colored. The night outside was quiet. Their apartment for once felt like a real home. And in that space the words didn't feel like a power play. They felt like a plea. She didn't answer immediately. She just looked at him, this man who was no longer just the CEO, no longer just a silent partner in a secret deal. He was standing in her kitchen, offering something she didn't know how to hold. Something real. Finally she whispered, "Okay." He didn't smile, not in the way most people do. Instead he stepped closer, his voice even lower now. "We'll do it your way. Slowly. Quietly. Until you're ready." Sumin looked up and yawned. "Is it bedtime?" Min-jae scooped her up. "Almost. Let's brush your teeth first." Jesus watched them disappear into the hallway. And for the first time since she signed that marriage contract, she didn't feel like a stranger in her own home. Outside, however, the battle lines were forming. It began the next morning with a headline. Not a front-page scandal, but one of those subtle, deeply planted articles in a mid-tier business blog that most people in corporate circles pretended not to read but always kept bookmarked. Myri Group CEO possibly married in secret. Sources suggest contractual arrangement with single mother. The language was carefully chosen, vague enough to avoid lawsuits, but sharp enough to provoke speculation. The comments section buzzed with condescending theories. Some readers guessed she was a social climber. Others insisted it had to be fake. Cha Min-jae would never settle for someone with baggage. The fact that people used the word baggage to describe a 5-year-old child was disgusting, but not surprising. Seoul's corporate elite had a particular vocabulary for anything they didn't understand. And they loved to misunderstand women like Jesus. By the time Jesus dropped Sumin off at kindergarten and walked into the grocery store, she could already feel the heat of the stairs. A cashier whispered something to a bag boy. A woman near the spinach section blatantly pointed at her, then pulled out her phone. But it wasn't until she reached the tofu aisle that an older woman finally walked straight up to her and said, "Are you the one who married that Myri Group man?" Jesus didn't flinch. She simply nodded once, pushed her cart forward and said, "Yes," without stopping. The woman's jaw dropped in real time. That answer wasn't what she'd been expecting. Maybe a denial. Maybe some shame. But Jesus didn't owe her anything. Not an apology, not a performance, not a justification. At Myri HQ the atmosphere was no less chaotic. Assistant Director Kim burst into Minji's office carrying a tablet with the article open. "We think someone from the internal PR team leaked it. Possibly on Kang Nari's orders. It's written to sound unofficial so it can be denied later." Min-jae didn't blink. He scrolled through the page, calmly reading every word. The narrative was predictable. Poorly disguised contempt, decorated as concern. "Sir," Kim added nervously, "do you want to release a statement?" "No, then shall I do nothing?" Min-jae said flatly. "We don't acknowledge bottom feeders. If we respond, we legitimize them." Kim hesitated, then asked carefully, "And the board?" Min-jae looked up. "The board has already approved my personal affairs staying out of business. If they have concerns, they'll call me directly." As if on cue his phone rang. It was his mother. He picked up. "Yes, mother?" Her voice came through like a blade. "You said it would remain private. You promised." "I never promised. I said I would handle it. Do you realize how many calls I've had this morning? The wives of 5 different board members have asked me about her background." Min-jae remained seated, calm. "Tell them to ask me next time. I warned you this would happen. I warned you what it would mean if this arrangement became public. It's not an arrangement. It's a marriage." There was a beat of silence. "I'll be in your office in 20 minutes, she snapped, and the call ended. Min-jae leaned back in his chair. This too had been inevitable. His mother had built her reputation on the idea that their family was above scandal, above controversy, above the ordinary messiness of real life. A son secretly marrying a single mother with no pedigree was the kind of thing she saw as a personal betrayal. He had expected her wrath. What surprised him was how little he cared now. Looking her up, she wanted to know exactly what they were finding. She typed her own name into the search bar and clicked through the results. The same recycled photo of her from the two women stared at each other. The tension between them was sharp, but Hesa didn't flinch. She'd been through real battles, raising a child alone, juggling jobs, surviving days without electricity. This wasn't war. This was a wealthy woman flexing power she didn't yet understand how to use against someone who had nothing left to lose. Dian stood, smoothing her coat. "Well, it was nice finally meeting you." She offered a handshake. Hesa didn't take it. "Goodbye, miss you." After she left, Hesa closed the door slowly and leaned against it. The game had changed. She wasn't just an invisible wife anymore. She was a target. And if she wanted to survive this world, the world Minjae had built and the people trying to tear it down, she would need to stop walking around like an outsider. Because they were going to come for her. And she needed to be ready. The next few days passed in a blur. Hesa wasn't used to this kind of scrutiny, the subtle eyes watching her every move, the constant second-guessing of her simplest decisions. It was one thing to be looked down on when you were folding laundry in a stranger's house or cleaning up after an office party. That she could endure. But this was different. Now, people watched her not with indifference but with veiled hostility. Like she'd infiltrated a world that wasn't meant for her. The worst part wasn't even the whispering. It was the politeness. The kind that smiled with its teeth but made you feel small. Women who used to ignore her entirely now greeted her with brittle, forced warmth. Men who wouldn't have made eye contact before now gave her too much attention, curious if the rumors were true, that the CEO had married her out of pity, lust, or both. She didn't complain to Minjae. She didn't want to add to his pressure. And besides, he was already dealing with enough. The stockholders had been rattled. A few key investors requested informal meetings with Myri's strategy team. One board member even dared to suggest postponing the fall expansion plan until the CEO's domestic matters are stabilized. Minjae kept his composure, but the political undercurrent was strong. People weren't just whispering about him anymore. They were planning around him. And he knew that if he didn't neutralize the tension soon, someone, possibly Dian, would exploit the doubt for her own gain. Late one evening, after putting Sumin to bed, Hesa sat alone at the kitchen table with her laptop open. She wasn't doom-scrolling or reading gossip. She was researching. If people were going to keep her university days had made its rounds, graduation robe, messy ponytail, smile too big for the frame. It looked innocent. Too innocent. Next to headlines suggesting a secret marriage, it almost seemed like she was a naive girl who had no idea what she'd stepped into. But she wasn't naive. Not anymore. When Minjae came home that night, he found her still at the table, reading legal documentation about private equity firms and shareholder lawsuits. He raised an eyebrow. "What are you doing?" She didn't look up. "Learning what I'm up against." He chuckled softly, but his voice was gentle. "You're not up against anyone." She finally looked at him. "That's not true. I just haven't said anything about it yet." He sat down across from her. "You don't need to fight. I'll handle it." She nodded. "I know you will. But that doesn't mean I should sit here pretending none of this affects me." He studied her face, calm, focused, alert. The same woman who had once wiped coffee off marble floors in his building now sat across from him, reading strategic business documents like it was second nature. She didn't belong in their world? No. That world had no idea what it was about to face. 2 days later, Hesu attended her first official Myri event, not as a cleaning lady in the background but as the CEO's wife. It was a charity gala, hosted in collaboration with a foreign investors foundation. The guest list included corporate royalty, political figures, international delegates, and enough photographers to make any normal person want to crawl under a table. Hesu wore a navy blue dress, simple, elegant, nothing too flashy. She hadn't hired a stylist. She hadn't needed one. She knew her frame, knew what worked for her, and she didn't want to look like she was trying to be someone else. Still, as they stepped out of the black car, arm in arm, she could feel every flashbulb capturing her like she was some rare artifact. There was no hiding anymore. And she didn't try to. The real challenge came inside. Udian was already there, of course, dressed in gold and surrounded by other bored wives and socialites. She spotted them instantly and smiled like she'd been expecting them. As they approached, she extended a perfectly manicured hand toward Hesu. "You look lovely," she said smoothly. Hesu took her hand and replied, thank you. So do you. The other women watched, clearly amused. One of them, a younger wife with a bored expression, tilted her head. I heard you used to work in this building. As part of the maintenance team, right? The way she said it, maintenance team, was deliberate. As if trying to elevate the insult just enough to sound clever. Haisa met her gaze. Yes. I cleaned up after events just like this. The woman raised an eyebrow. And now you attend them. No, Haisa corrected. Now I'm part of the company that hosts them. The air shifted slightly. Min-jae, still beside her, gave the woman a polite but cool look. If any of you have concerns about the direction Myri Group is taking, my office is always open. But do be aware, I never confuse wealth with intelligence. Or status with relevance. The comment landed hard and several of the women laughed nervously, unsure whether it was safe to find it funny. Dian, however, remained poised. We were simply curious, she said. That's all. Asa smiled. Curiosity is healthy. Just be careful it doesn't turn into obsession. That's when things get dangerous. Dian's smile froze just a little. Haesu had learned fast. Too fast for their comfort. By the end of the evening, Haesu had spoken to half a dozen investors, 2 journalists, and even one board member's wife who quietly admitted she was rooting for her. Not all of us were born with a silver spoon, the woman had whispered. Some of us married into this circus too. It was a small comment, but Haesu remembered it. Not everyone in that room wanted her to fail. Just enough of them. After the event, on the way home, Haesu leaned her head back against the car seat. That was exhausting. Min-jae glanced at her, amused. You were incredible. She looked at him. Do you think they'll ever stop seeing me as the outsider? He paused. Some will. Most won't. But eventually they'll stop underestimating you. And that's what really matters. At home, Sumin was already asleep, tucked into bed by their kind housekeeper. Haesu checked on him quietly, brushing his hair back, grateful that he didn't have to know how chaotic the adult world was. At least not yet. But as she walked back to the living room, she noticed something strange. An envelope left on the entry table. No name, no address. Just a flat, cream-colored envelope sealed with wax. She picked it up and opened it. Inside was a single card, handwritten. You don't belong in his world. Walk away before it destroys you. No signature. No clue who sent it. But Haesu didn't need a name. She could feel the intent behind it. And whoever had sent it had no idea who they were dealing with. Haesu didn't mention the envelope to Min-jae that night. Not because she wanted to hide anything from him, but because it wasn't the kind of thing that needed immediate alarm. A single card, and signed, clearly meant to rattle her. She knew a scare tactic when she saw one. And she also knew how people like that operated. They thrived on reaction. Giving them nothing, no trace of fear, was the most potent response. Still, she slid the card into a drawer in her study and locked it. Not out of fear, but because she believed in keeping records. In this world, memory wasn't enough. You needed proof. The next morning was a return to routine. Sumin spilled juice all over his school uniform, Haesu packed an extra snack in his bag, and Min-jae left early for a meeting with the legal team regarding a pending supplier acquisition. The ordinary rhythm of family life gave her a kind of peace, even if it only lasted an hour or two. But the moment she stepped outside their apartment and into the waiting elevator, that calm fractured again. Dian was already inside. Alone. Wearing sunglasses indoors and scrolling idly through her phone. Haesu almost stepped back out, but she caught herself. No, not today. She walked in, pressed the lobby button, and stood silently beside her. Dian spoke first, without looking up. You know, I've always admired women like you. Haesu didn't respond. Dian continued, still calmly. The ones who climb up from the bottom. It's impressive, really. All that resilience, all that scrappiness. Haesu's tone was measured. You sound like someone rehearsing an insult disguised as praise. Finally, Dian turned to her. Just being honest, do you know what the real difference between us is? Haesu kept her gaze forward. I'm guessing you're going to tell me. You married into this world, Dian said flatly. I was born in it. That's something you'll never understand. People like you are always trying to adapt, to blend in, but deep down you'll always feel like an imposter. Haesu didn't flinch. That's where you're wrong. I don't want to blend in. I don't need their approval. And honestly, I don't care what any of you think. But here's the difference between us. You care too much. That's why I bother you. You see me as a threat. Not because I have what you want, but because I have it without needing your permission. The elevator doors opened. Haesu stepped out first, not looking back. Dian stayed behind, quiet for once. Later that afternoon, Heisu visited Myri headquarters. Not for an event, not even for Min-jae, but for herself. After the gala and the strange card, something in her had shifted. She wanted to see for herself what this place looked like now, not from the service corridors but from the top floors, the executive offices where actual decisions were made. Min-jae hadn't expected her visit, but he wasn't surprised either. She walked into his office just as he finished a call. "Do I need an appointment now?" she asked. He smiled. "Only if you want to interrupt board meetings." One evening, while finishing some late spreadsheets at the office, her team lead leaned over. "You used to work here before, right? Like, in cleaning or something?" Heisu didn't hesitate. "Yes." The woman blinked, slightly thrown off. "And now you're here?" Heisu looked at her calmly. "Yes. Why?" The woman shrugged. "Nothing. Just, most people wouldn't come back. Especially not like this." Heisu smiled. "Maybe that's the problem with most people." Back home, Min-jae watched her differently now, not just with love but with admiration. This wasn't the same woman who had shyly wiped her hands on her jeans when they first met. This was someone sharper, steadier, more aware of herself than ever. And when she talked about quarterly reports or departmental politics, he listened, not as her husband but as her peer. The world still whispered. But Heisu no longer cared. Every step she took now was hers alone. And the farther she went, the more undeniable it became. She didn't need to be accepted into their world. She was building her own. The whispers didn't stop. They just evolved. Around the office, people began noticing her quiet competence. The way she never interrupted in meetings but always managed to steer conversations back on track with one well-placed question. They saw how she took on grunt work without complaint and how even their overly picky team lead stopped second-guessing her analysis. But with curiosity came gossip. It started with her background. Some said she used to work as support staff at headquarters, others claimed she was someone's niece trying to make it on her own. One in turn even whispered she was an HR experiment. But no one suspected the truth because Heisu was too ordinary. She packed her own lunch, wore modest clothes, took the subway home. No heels, no designer bags, no flashy makeup. Nothing about her suggested wealth or power. She was careful like that. Intentionally invisible. But Min-jae noticed. He noticed everything. How she was up at night brushing through PDFs and industry reports. How she double-checked formulas on Excel without any expectation of praise. How she came home sometimes looking more fulfilled than tired, as if proving herself on her own terms had ignited something deeper in her. And he never interfered. He never asked how it was going or offered to help. He just made sure to leave her fresh coffee every morning and heat up her dinner when she worked late. Sometimes, support was best expressed in silence. Still, it wasn't all peaceful. The anonymous threats had stopped coming, but a new tension began to rise inside Myri's walls. And this time, it wasn't directed at Heisu alone. The executive committee had begun pushing back on Min-jae's leadership. Quietly at first. Passive-aggressive memos. Delayed approvals. A couple of unusually blunt comments during quarterly reviews. Then came the murmurs of a board challenge. His biggest rival wasn't Dean's father directly, but an older VP named Park Jung-go, a Myri veteran who had always viewed Min-jae as an untested figurehead propped up by legacy and good press. Jung-go had allies in legal, a whisper network among senior managers, and the kind of old-money arrogance that made him dangerous in boardrooms. Heisu caught wind of it before Min-jae did. Not through espionage or eavesdropping, but through numbers. Her team had been analyzing the budget reallocations for internal restructuring. She noticed discrepancies. Projects being quietly defunded. Departmental resources redirected to compliance and oversight. On paper it looked like tightening operations. In reality, it was a textbook power move, drying out sections of the company aligned with the current CEO to empower others. It was subtle, almost surgical. But not invisible. One night, over dinner, Heisu brought it up. She didn't present it emotionally or as a concerned spouse. She brought her laptop to the table, opened the files, and laid out the analysis in a clear, precise tone. This isn't just routine shuffling. They're moving capital strategically, stacking influence under Jung-go's circle. I don't know if it's a coup, but it's not random. Min-jae leaned back in his chair, staring at the screen. These numbers? How long has this been happening? She hesitated. 3 months. But it accelerated after the gala. He nodded slowly. You think they see you as a liability? She shook her head. No. I think they see you as one. A distracted CEO. Someone they believe can be removed cleanly before Q4. There was a long pause. Then he asked, "What do you think I should do?" She answered honestly, "You need to fight back. Not emotionally, strategically. The same way they're doing it. But you also need allies. You've been too independent for too long. No CEO survives alone." It wasn't a lecture. It was strategy. And Min Jae, for the first time in a long time, didn't feel like he was talking to his wife. He felt like he was talking to someone he could go to war with. Over the next week, Min Jae began shifting his approach. He opened dialogues with overlooked department heads. He initiated town halls with younger staff. He sat in on supply chain meetings and public relations briefings, rebuilding internal trust from the ground up. People responded. They didn't see a distant CEO anymore. They saw someone fighting for the company and, more importantly, listening. Jungo noticed too. And as expected, he escalated. A formal board complaint was filed against Min Jae, accusing him of nepotism, citing undisclosed conflicts of interest, and vague mentions of company resources being redirected inappropriately. The irony was painful. Min Jae had bent over backward to keep Jesus' position anonymous. She worked harder than anyone on her team, and even now, no one outside the top executive tier knew who she really was. But the complaint was still submitted. The message was clear: "We're watching your wife and we'll use her against you if needed." Min Jae came home that night unusually quiet. Asa knew something had changed. He sat down beside her on the couch, staring at nothing. "They filed it," he said. Jungo finally made his move. She didn't ask what he was going to do. She only asked, "Are you going to let me speak?" He turned to her. "At the board?" She nodded. "Yes. Not as your wife. As an employee. I want to speak to the allegations myself. On record." He hesitated. "They'll attack you." "They're already doing that," she replied. "The question is whether I let them define me, or I do it myself." A few days later, the board convened. It was an emergency session, officially to review operational ethics, but everyone in the room knew what it was. A political ambush. Min Jae sat at the head of the table, composed but tense. Jungo made his opening statements, all carefully worded. Concerns about transparency, fiduciary responsibility, company image. Then came the inevitable mention: "We have learned that an employee in the strategy department, one Miss Yoon Hae, is in fact the CEO's spouse, which raises serious concerns about." He didn't even finish the sentence. That's when Hae-soo entered. She wore nothing flashy. Just a neat blouse, slacks, and a badge clipped to her belt like everyone else. She wasn't escorted. She didn't need to be. She took the empty chair at the end of the table, opened a thin folder, and calmly placed down several printed pages. "These are my work logs," she said. "Tasks assigned, completed, and verified by my team lead. Here's a copy of the internal application I submitted under my maiden name. And here," she tapped the folder, "is the performance evaluation signed by 2 senior managers who didn't even know I was married to Mr. Kong." Silence. She continued, her voice clear but never aggressive. "I never asked for special treatment. I never received it. If anything, I've been evaluated more harshly than others. But I came here not to defend myself. I came here to ask a question. Is this company more afraid of a woman doing her job, or of the fact that she does it well?" There was a long pause. Then she added, "If my marriage disqualifies me from competence, then perhaps the problem isn't nepotism. It's misogyny." She didn't wait for applause. She didn't need it. She gathered her papers and walked out just as calmly as she entered. Min Jae watched her go, his expression unreadable. Around the room, board members shifted in their chairs. A few looked away. Others scribbled notes. Jungo said nothing. The vote didn't happen that day. Instead, the complaint was tabled. Then quietly buried. Hae-soo returned to work like nothing had happened. But everything had changed. Her colleagues looked at her differently now. Not because of her status, but because of her courage. She had stepped into the lion's den and walked out taller. And that was just the beginning. After the board meeting, nothing was officially said, but everything shifted beneath the surface. The complaint against Min Jae disappeared from the agenda, and Jungo's name stopped being whispered with the same boldness. No formal apology was made to Hae-soo, of course. Corporate machinery never apologized, but the quiet retreat was its own admission. In the days that followed, her team treated her with a new kind of respect. They still didn't know her identity as the CEO's wife, but her composure in that meeting had made the rounds. No one knew the full story, but they knew she had walked into a boardroom and faced down the people who ran the company, and she hadn't flinched. It earned her something more valuable than sympathy. It earned her credibility. But it also made her more visible than she ever wanted to be. She was no longer anonymous within Myri, even if her marriage to Min-jae remained officially undisclosed. Her every move began to draw eyes. When she stayed late at her desk, people noticed. When she presented her work in meetings, even senior managers made the effort to sit up straighter and listen. Some began sending her feedback that bordered on admiration. Others, predictably, began whispering again. Only now, it wasn't about her being a cleaning lady. It was about her being a wild card. She's not what we thought. She's not just some temp. Do you think she's aiming for something higher? She ignored the comments as she always had. But she could feel the walls narrowing around her, the illusion of invisibility shrinking fast. Min-jae too had changed. He never brought up the meeting again, but the way he looked at her was different. Not more affectionate, he had always been affectionate, but with a kind of reverence. Like he was seeing a version of her he hadn't fully recognized before. A woman who wasn't just his equal at home, but someone who could stand next to him, inside the battlefield of corporate warfare, and never blink. They didn't talk about strategy anymore in whispers. She now sat in on his closed-door meetings at home, gave opinions on internal hires, flagged names from her own floor who could be quietly cultivated into loyalists. They were partners now in every way, husband and wife, yes, but also chess players watching the board, thinking 3 moves ahead. Still, Hae-soo knew something had to give. She couldn't keep working anonymously forever. The tighter her circle became, the more dangerous it would be when the truth came out, not because of betrayal but because of the narrative. She didn't want to be the woman who pretended to be someone else. She wanted to be honest on her terms. So one evening, as she walked home from the subway, she made a decision. She would tell her team herself. Not as a spectacle. Not with press. Just face to face in a quiet room, with the people she worked with every day. She picked the right time. Friday afternoon, after the last presentation of the week, when everyone was winding down with coffee and leftover pastries from a team lunch. She stood near the whiteboard, waited for the conversation to slow, then gently cleared her throat. They all looked up, expecting a project reminder. I wanted to share something with you all, she began, keeping her voice level. Not because I have to, but because I respect you. The room tensed. 1 or 2 sat up. One paused mid-sip. My name is Yoon-hae. That's my legal name. But outside this office, I'm also Kang Hae-soo, married to CEO Kang Min-jae. The silence was immediate and sharp. I joined this company under my maiden name, she continued. Not to hide anything but because I wanted to work. Really work. I wanted to see what I could do on my own merit. I never asked for protection. I never asked for exceptions. And you've all treated me like one of your own, sometimes critically, sometimes supportively, but always fairly. I appreciate that more than you know. She didn't beg for understanding. She didn't explain every detail. She simply bowed slightly and added, if any of you feel uncomfortable working with me going forward, I understand. But I hope my work has earned your trust more than my name ever could. No one spoke for several seconds. Then her team lead, an older woman named Ji-young who'd never once sugar-coated anything in her life, nodded once. You still meet deadlines. You still reply to emails faster than anyone. You still clean up the shared drive without being asked. That's what matters. A few chuckled quietly. One said, guess that explains why you didn't panic during the executive audit. Another muttered, we had a CEO's wife running pivot tables. It broke the tension. They didn't treat her with awe. They didn't bow or start acting differently. They simply accepted the truth with the same workplace practicality they used for everything else. That was exactly what Hae-soo had hoped for. But not everyone in the company was so pragmatic. News of her disclosure spread faster than expected. By Monday morning, her inbox was overflowing with vague messages. From HR, from internal communications, even from the PR team asking if she would be willing to participate in a Women of Myri feature series. She declined politely. She hadn't come forward to become a face or a symbol. She just wanted her corner of the world to be honest. Still, the spotlight couldn't be controlled forever. That same week, the company hosted a charity fundraiser at a luxury hotel downtown. It wasn't a glamorous event, more of a check-the-box corporate thing, but most executives attended, including Min-jae. For the first time since she had joined Myri, Hae-soo accompanied him publicly. Not as an employee, not as a guest, but as his wife. The room stilled when they entered together. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but she saw it. The way glasses paused midair. The way names on name tags were glanced at and then looked at again. The whispering didn't last long. Min-jae, in his calm, authoritative way, simply walked her through the room, greeting people evenly. You already know my wife, he said once. She's the one who flagged the Q3 misreporting before anyone else caught it. You've worked with her before, he said another time, smiling faintly. She's smarter than me. He didn't elevate her above them. He placed her beside them. As if to say, you already know her. Now you just know the rest of her. Later that evening, Jesus stepped out onto the terrace for air. She didn't like attention. She never had. The stars were just barely visible above the city lights, and she was enjoying the silence when someone joined her. It was Jungo. He didn't say anything for a moment. Just stood there nursing a drink. Then, you're clever. I'll give you that. She didn't respond. He turned slightly. You know the board doesn't like surprises. This could still cost you. She looked at him, her voice calm. What costs more, honesty or silence? He didn't answer. Just gave a short laugh and walked away. That night, when she and Minjae returned home, she curled onto the couch beside him. Neither spoke for a while. Then he murmured, "You handled tonight perfectly." She closed her eyes against his shoulder. It's only just beginning. The shift from hidden wife to public partner didn't transform Hace's life overnight, but it did rearrange its gravity. She no longer walked through the company halls as just another mid-level employee. People still greeted her professionally, but their eyes lingered a little longer. Some smiled with a flicker of guilt, as if they were remembering the days when they'd barely acknowledged her presence in the break room. Others seemed almost disappointed, as though her new visibility somehow took something away from the myth they had invented about her. She wasn't angry. In fact, she understood. She had created the situation herself. The version of her they knew, the quiet, diligent, nameless woman who once restocked the office printer, was a version she had intentionally given them. But now that version no longer fit. It wasn't just her colleagues adjusting. HR held a meeting in her honor, thinly veiled as a diversity spotlight, where they praised her inspiring duality and encouraged others to embrace authenticity. Hesa didn't say much during it. She knew the corporate language well enough to recognize when something was more about optics than substance. It didn't offend her. It just reminded her how fragile sincerity was in a building full of agendas. Minjae, on the other hand, took everything in stride. He handled the board delicately, managing their discomfort with his usual balance of charm and steel. Some directors expressed concern that his marriage had gone unannounced for so long. Others, predictably, questioned whether Jesus' presence in the company presented a conflict of interest. He addressed both matters calmly. Her hiring had followed every protocol, and her performance, as her manager's evaluations showed, exceeded expectations. If anything, she'd made sacrifices most spouses wouldn't have tolerated. And if the board believes her being my wife is a risk, he'd said in one closed-door meeting, then perhaps the issue isn't her presence, but your discomfort with the idea that she earned her place here, with or without my name. Even his most vocal critics couldn't argue with the numbers. Hace's department had improved efficiency by nearly 18% since she joined. Employee retention on her team was the highest in 3 years. Her contributions weren't theoretical. They were measurable. Still, her integration into the upper layers of the company created tension in subtler ways. At luncheons, she was now seated next to people who once barely noticed her. Senior executives would offer her polite, strained conversation, some trying too hard to seem casual, others making a point to act indifferent, both equally transparent. She didn't try to prove herself anymore. That part was over. But neither did she pretend to be someone she wasn't. She remained observant, honest, and quiet. And that, oddly enough, was what unsettled them most. She wasn't seeking power, and yet power followed her. Not because of her husband, but because she didn't flinch in a room full of people who expected her to. People noticed that. Meanwhile, Jungo hadn't backed off, but his tone had shifted. He no longer spoke with the smugness of someone holding a secret weapon. Instead, his remarks were laced with calculated civility, like a man who knew the game was still on, even if his hand had weakened. One day, he crossed paths with her in the hallway, offering a short nod. "You've become a symbol, you know," he said, not quite smiling. "For better or worse." Hesa looked him squarely in the eye. "I'm not interested in being a symbol. I'm interested in doing the work. Work gets messy when people see you as more than just your role." She didn't argue. She knew exactly what he meant. Back at home, life with Minjae had deepened. Their late-night talks now covered strategy, ethics, employee dynamics, things they never had time to share before. He respected her perspective, asked for her analysis on problems he once handled alone. She never overstepped, never tried to control, but her presence had become an invisible stabilizer. He often said that with her beside him, He felt like he was playing with both eyes open for the first time. Yet there were cracks they both began to notice, shadows that crept in slowly. One came in the form of a new executive, Director Shin, a recent hire from a rival firm. She was sharp, well-dressed, and politically agile. The kind of person who smiled with her teeth but listened with her eyes. She had quickly positioned herself close to the board's conservative faction and made subtle jabs in meetings that disguised themselves as compliments. "Your wife's presence at the last partner event was refreshing," Shin said to Min-jae once during a budget meeting. "It's so rare to see spouses who really understand our world, let alone have opinions on internal policy." Min-jae smiled politely. "That's because her opinions are usually better than mine." "Of course," Shin replied with a demure nod. "It's just, in some circles that might raise concerns about balance." The message was clear. Too much visibility and Haesu became a threat. That night, Min-jae told Haesu about the exchange. She didn't react strongly. "They're testing boundaries," she said. "They want to see if I'm content being your wife, or if I plan to be something more. You don't have to prove anything." "I'm not trying to. But that doesn't mean I should disappear again." He watched her closely. "Would you ever want to move higher in the company? Officially?" The question hung between them. She thought about it longer than she expected. "Maybe one day. But not like this. Not as your wife. I'd rather start over somewhere else than get promoted because people feel forced to respect me." He didn't push. And she didn't elaborate. But they both knew, deep down, that her path, wherever it led, wouldn't be small. Weeks passed. The rumors faded, replaced by newer scandals, fresh gossip. The company continued spinning forward, its machinery relentless. But within that machinery, a new axis had quietly formed. Haesu wasn't just tolerated. She was being watched, studied. Some feared her. Others admired her. A few wanted to ally with her. None of them could predict what she would do next. But neither could she. Because for the first time in her life, she wasn't following a plan. She wasn't surviving or hiding or proving. She was simply being, and discovering, to her surprise, how powerful that could be. The Monday morning meeting began like any other, polite nods, hushed tones of phones being silenced, the casual clatter of coffee cups settling onto glass tables. But something in the air felt different to Haesu as she entered the executive conference room alongside Min-jae. Not because of anything said aloud but because of what wasn't. People were watching her more closely now, not with the thin curiosity of initial discovery, but with sharpened interest. Ever since Director Shin's careful planting of doubts in casual conversation, subtle changes had started unfolding. Invitations became more selective. She was looped into fewer internal memos despite her official position remaining unchanged. Her suggestions, when voiced, were acknowledged but rarely implemented. It wasn't open hostility, but the pressure was there. It was how systems enforce silence. Not by yelling you down but by slowly turning down the volume on your voice. Haesu hadn't mentioned any of it to Min-jae. Not because she was trying to hide it, but because she needed to understand the pattern herself before involving him. Besides, she was used to this. The corporate world wasn't that different from the life she'd lived before. The assumptions people made about her appearance, the underestimation, the dismissive glances. She had learned early on that speaking up wasn't always about changing minds. Sometimes it was about cataloging what needed to be exposed later. But she also knew this time was different. Now there was no anonymity to protect her. She wasn't invisible. She was the CEO's wife. Every move she made was a mirror to his. Every reaction she offered could be used to paint him as biased, weak, influenced. That wasn't just her burden. It was his vulnerability too. Min-jae, for his part, seemed to sense some of this even without her saying it. After one particularly tense leadership meeting where her project proposal was sidelined in favor of a redundant, less effective alternative suggested by Shin, he asked her privately in the elevator, "Do you want me to step in?" She shook her head. "No. That's exactly what they're waiting for. To prove I only succeed if you intervene. You shouldn't have to fight this alone." "I'm not fighting. I'm watching. Let them show who they are." He didn't argue. But his jaw was tense and she could tell he hated feeling like his hands were tied. That week, something unexpected happened. A long-forgotten incident resurfaced. The internal audit that Haesu had quietly reported during her early days at the company. Back then, someone from the finance team had been skimming petty cash reimbursements. Nothing major but enough to raise flags. Her anonymous report had triggered a review, which eventually led to a quiet dismissal. She'd never spoken about it, not even to Min-jae, because she'd never needed the credit. She did it because it was the right thing. But now her name was being attached to that report. Someone had unearthed the details, trying to spin the narrative that she had acted vindicatively to settle scores as a junior employee. It was transparent nonsense, but the timing was deliberate. They wanted to stir doubt, make her look calculating, dangerous even. What they didn't expect was the response. One of her old colleagues from that department, a quiet but sharp manager named Sohyun, spoke up in an internal Slack thread. She not only confirmed the misconduct had been real, but credited Haesu for likely saving their budget from being bled further. Another employee chimed in, someone who had left the company last year, sharing how Haesu's anonymous mentoring had helped her stay in the field when she almost gave up. Suddenly the conversation turned. The people who actually knew Haesu, not the ones sitting in corner offices, began to speak. Min-jae stayed out of it publicly, but privately he told her, "You don't need a PR department. Your honesty builds its own." But Haesu wasn't celebrating. Not yet. She knew how fragile goodwill could be. In this world, a single misstep could undo everything. And that misstep was coming, she could feel it. It arrived in the form of an invitation. Director Shin was organizing a strategic leadership summit in Busan, a 2-day off-site event filled with panels, roundtables, and informal dinners meant to bond the company's top players. Haesu, technically, was just below the formal invitation threshold based on her department's level. But somehow she received an invitation anyway. Along with a handwritten note, "We hope your unique perspective can contribute to the dialogue." It was bait. Elegant, well-dressed bait. Min-jae read the note and glanced at her. "They want a reaction. And they'll get one if I refuse. So you'll go?" "I'll go," she said. "But not to play their game." She spent the next few days preparing, not by rehearsing speeches or mapping alliances, but by digging. She reviewed old budgets, staff memos, cross-department metrics. She identified areas where leadership said one thing but practiced another, like the gender equity initiative that hadn't improved promotion rates in 2 years, or the sustainability program that still outsourced to questionable vendors. She didn't plan to attack. She planned to ask questions, publicly, gently but specifically. At the summit she dressed plainly. Not underdressed, but not like someone trying to make a statement. She attended every panel, took notes, asked pointed questions that left vague answers squirming. During dinner, when a senior VP made a dismissive remark about young female hires being unprepared for real-world stress, she asked calmly, "Is that based on turnover data or personal frustration?" The man choked on his wine. Laughter rippled around the table, not at her expense, but at the unmasking. That night, alone in her hotel room, she stared out at the city skyline. For once, she wasn't thinking about strategy or politics. She was thinking about who she used to be, the girl who worked 2 jobs, who rode the night bus half asleep, who felt invisible. That girl would never have imagined standing here, challenging executives, making them squirm without raising her voice. Min-jae called, his voice soft. "You're all over the internal group chat. Apparently you made an entire panel rethink their hiring pipeline." She chuckled. "That wasn't the goal. But it was the effect. They still don't know what to do with me. That's what makes you powerful." "No. That's what makes me real." There was silence for a moment, then he said, "When you come back, I think we should talk about next steps. About giving you a position where your influence matches your capability. I thought we agreed not to mix roles. I'm not talking about promotions. I'm talking about legacy." She let the words sink in. For once it didn't scare her. She wasn't a secret anymore. She wasn't an outsider. She wasn't anyone's footnote or accessory. She was Haesu. And her story was no longer about what people thought she was. It was about what she chose to become. The summit was over, but its ripples traveled far beyond the brief trip to Busan. When Haesu returned to Seoul, she didn't expect applause, and she certainly didn't get it, not from those hoping to see her fail. But she did notice something quieter and far more telling. The tone had shifted. The passive-aggressive comments dulled. The lingering stares in the hallway, the fake smiles, all began to vanish under the pressure of something harder to fight: earned respect. No matter how much some wanted to dismiss her as just the CEO's wife, the woman in the modest black blazer who dismantled lazy assumptions and held her ground during the summit panels had proven she wasn't there by accident. And worse, for her critics, she hadn't played dirty to get there. That kind of quiet victory doesn't go unnoticed. It unsettles people who thrive on chaos and drama because it leaves them nothing to latch onto. But Haesu knew better than to get comfortable. Respect earned too early without official titles to match was unstable ground. She wasn't looking for a crown, but she needed permanence, her own space in the company that wasn't tied to Minji's shadow. The summit had given her something more useful than approval. It gave her leverage. Back at HQ, Min-jae called her into his office. Not in secret this time but in full view, glass walls and all. He wasn't performing but he also wasn't hiding. That meant something. He gestured to the chair across from his desk and slid a folder toward her. Inside was a proposed structural reorganization. We're setting up a new internal innovation unit, he said. It'll report directly to me for now. No one knows the gaps in this company like you do. Haesu glanced through the plan. It was ambitious, cross-functional collaboration, direct budget authority, long-term project ownership. It wasn't a promotion, it was a redesign of responsibility. And her name was penciled in under lead strategist. This will make people uncomfortable, she said evenly. Min-jae nodded. They're already uncomfortable. Might as well put that discomfort to use. And if this blows back on you? I can take it. She looked at him, measuring that answer. Then she set the folder down carefully. I'll do it. But under one condition. He raised a brow. I want no special press releases. No glowing internal emails. I don't want people to clap because I'm your wife. I want them to watch what I build and feel foolish for ever thinking I was the janitor. Min-jae smiled, not the careful CEO smile he gave in meetings, but the real one, the one that softened his features and made him look years younger. That's exactly why you should lead it. By the following Monday, the restructuring was announced. No big fanfare, no spotlight. Just a brief internal memo listing department updates and new assignments. Some people blinked at the line about Haesu's new role, but no one said much, not yet. They were waiting to see if it was real, or just a favor disguised as reform. Haesu got to work. Her new department didn't have a fixed office, so she claimed a smaller and used space near the data analytics wing. It was quieter there, away from the polished main corridors where directors strutted. She brought in her own coffee machine, pinned handwritten schedules on the wall, and started assembling a team, not from the usual elite shortlist, but from the forgotten corners of the company. Junior staff with ideas no one had listened to. Mid-level managers who had been passed over despite strong reviews. People who didn't fit the mold but clearly had drive. It raised eyebrows, of course. One executive even joked that she was collecting strays. Haesu only smiled. Strays are just overlooked talent with nowhere to go. That makes them dangerous, in the best way. Within weeks, her unit began producing measurable improvements. A proposal to consolidate overlapping vendor contracts. A feedback tool that slashed response time to internal complaints. A workflow optimization that reduced onboarding time by 28%. Nothing flashy but impossible to ignore. Still, pushback came, quiet then louder. Director Shin, unsurprisingly, didn't take well to being sidestepped. He began questioning her budget in weekly board meetings, suggesting audits, trying to force delays through red tape. But every time he launched a challenge, Haesu responded not with anger but with receipts. She documented everything. She kept logs. When he claimed she was using unauthorized consultants, she calmly handed over signed vendor approvals. When he suggested her hires were unqualified, she read aloud their performance stats. At first people were amused. Then they were impressed. And finally they were silent. She hadn't yelled once. She hadn't insulted anyone. She had simply done what so few in power feared most, her job with precision and proof. But outside the boardroom the atmosphere changed again. This time it was warmer. Employees she didn't know nodded at her in elevators. A junior associate left her a handwritten thank you note for intervening when his probation period was mishandled. An older staffer from maintenance, the same woman who once pointed her toward the supply closet assuming she was new janitorial staff, now greeted her with a respectful smile each morning and a soft, "Ma'am." The change wasn't in titles. It was in perception. One afternoon, while reviewing project data, she received a surprise call from Min-jae. "Can you come to my office? There's someone here who wants to speak with you." She walked in to find a man she hadn't seen in weeks. Mr. Gong, the elderly man she'd once helped on that rainy day outside the building. He stood slowly, leaning on a cane, but his posture was straighter now, his eyes brighter. "I wanted to thank you," he said. "I've been watching." Asa smiled. "I'm glad to see you looking better. You didn't know who I was. You just gave. That's rare." She said nothing, unsure what to add. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out an envelope. "This is my personal recommendation," he said. "To the board. For you." Asa looked at Min-jae, surprised. He simply nodded. Mr. Gong added, "I may be retired but my voice still carries some weight in this company. And I think it's time people knew what kind of foundation this place really needs. She took the envelope but didn't open it. Not yet. It wasn't about validation. It was about building something that no one could deny, not through rumor or assumption or resentment. As Mr. Gong turned to leave, he looked back and said, "Let them laugh all they want. You were never cleaning their floors. You were sweeping out their arrogance." Heisu exhaled, feeling something shift inside her. Not victory, not vindication, just peace. The kind of quiet, steady peace that comes from finally being seen for who you are, not what people expected. She sat down beside Min-jae and for a moment they said nothing. They didn't need to. Because the work wasn't finished. But it had begun. And this time, no one could laugh her out of the room again. Despite the silent shifts in attitude throughout the company, Heisu didn't let up. Recognition, while satisfying in brief moments, was never her end goal. She had built too much in isolation, been judged too often by appearances, and survived enough condescension to understand how fragile acceptance could be. All it took was one misstep, one bad quarter, one rumor spread over coffee, and it would all snap back. Her only option was to keep delivering value that no one could dispute. Let the data talk. Let the results weigh more than whispers. But that was easier said than done. A quiet storm was brewing beneath the surface. Director Shin hadn't accepted his diminished influence. He was too practiced, too strategic. The man hadn't climbed to a senior position by being foolish. He knew better than to confront Heisu outright now. Instead, he shifted tactics. Internal delays, withheld data, silent vetoes on cross-departmental proposals. Nothing that could be traced to him directly, just death by 1,000 bureaucratic cuts. The impact on Heisu's team was immediate. Timelines dragged. Cross-unit collaborations stalled for no stated reason. Once eager junior analysts began second-guessing their role, unsure whether their work would actually make it to implementation. Heisu noticed. She documented. But she also knew escalation wouldn't solve this. It would only make it look like a personal vendetta, not a structural issue. And in a company like this, perception could erode truth before facts ever got a chance to speak. So she adjusted. She began hosting daily stand-ups with her team, short, focused, with clear takeaways. She implemented internal trackers for every process touchpoint and trained her staff to log every delay in detail. If a department refused to share data, she'd file a formal collaboration request and CC the compliance officer, not with threats but with calm, procedural language that left no room for evasion. She didn't scream. She didn't accuse. She bled them dry with precision. It worked. Within 2 weeks, the stalls shrank. Timelines recovered. And most importantly, her team saw it. They saw a leader who didn't fold under passive sabotage but turned the system against itself to protect them. Their morale rose. The jokes returned. The late evenings felt less like punishment and more like shared purpose. Heisu, the woman once mistaken for a janitor, had quietly become the one leader in the building people trusted without pretense. Min-jae noticed too. Their personal relationship, still mostly hidden from the wider company, had evolved into something steadier, more unspoken. They rarely brought it into work, but when they were alone, late in the evening, going over reports side by side at home or exchanging glances during meetings, it was clear that what they had was no longer something that needed proving. Just was. But Min-jae had problems of his own. The board had begun pressuring him again, not about Heisu directly but through policy grumblings and strategic questions. They weren't happy with how much internal autonomy he was granting certain departments. They wanted tighter control. More traditional reporting structures. Less experimentation. Heisu's division, with its unconventional team and fast-track reforms, was an obvious target, though no one said it out loud. Min-jae brought it up one night over dinner, not as CEO to strategist, but as husband to wife. "They're nervous," he said, slicing a piece of steak without touching it. "You're changing too much too fast. It scares them." Heisu leaned back in her chair. "It's not too fast. They're just too comfortable." He looked at her, quiet for a moment. "You know, if it comes to a vote, I'll back you. But I also need to protect the company as a whole. If this becomes a war, we lose time and trust." "I'm not trying to start a war," she said. "I just want to finish what I started. And if they try to force you out, I won't go quietly." Min-jae smiled, though it was tight at the edges. "I never expected you to." The tension wasn't personal, it was professional, and they both understood the line between those two worlds better than anyone. But it reminded them both that even love didn't shield you from the realities of power. The situation came to a head during the quarterly review. The board summoned both Min-jae and Heisu, not together but back to back. Jesus entered the room with a single folder, no entourage, no projection screen, just a paper report and a black pen. Director Shin sat directly across from her. "We've been reviewing your department's cost-to-output ratio," he began, cool and composed. "Some of the results are unconventional." Jesus didn't blink. "That's because the goals weren't conventional. Innovation isn't linear. Be that as it may, we have shareholders to answer to." "I'm aware. Which is why we've saved $4.7 million in operational costs across 3 departments this quarter alone." Shin flipped a page in the dossier. "You've hired non-traditional staff. Many with no prior experience in major firms." Asa nodded. "And they've outperformed 2 veteran teams. Would you like the comparison charts?" A few chuckles around the table. Not cruel, curious. This wasn't the same woman they'd ignored in passing months ago. This was someone who could disarm a room without raising her voice. Another board member leaned in. "Where do you see this going? Long term?" Asa looked up. "I see a company where performance isn't judged by the polish on your shoes or how loudly you speak in meetings. In fact, most people used to walk past me without noticing I was in the room at all. Some of them even laughed at me. Because I was mopping a floor. Because I wore old sneakers. Because I wasn't what they expected." She paused, scanning the faces in the crowd. "But I want to tell you something they didn't know. Something they couldn't see. I was paying attention. I was learning. And when the time came, I knew more about how the place worked than most of them ever would." The applause came slowly, not because the audience wasn't moved, but because they were absorbing something real. Not a fairy tale, not a sanitized success story, but a lived experience. After the speech, a young woman from the audience followed her backstage. She looked nervous but determined. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Of course," Jesus replied. "Did it ever feel like, no matter what you did, they were still going to see you as less?" Jesus didn't answer right away. She thought about the boardroom where a VP once addressed her as Miss, assuming she was just delivering coffee. She thought about the rumor mill that spun around her marriage, her work ethic, her credibility. She thought about the laughter. "Yes," she said softly. "It did. For a long time." "And what did you do?" "I kept going," Jesus said. "Not because I knew it would change them, but because I refused to let them define me." That night, Min-jae greeted her at home with takeout containers and his tie loosened. He poured her tea as she changed into pajamas. As they ate in comfortable silence, he looked over at her and said, "You know, the cleaning staff still talk about you." She raised an eyebrow, smiling. "Oh. They say you're the only executive who remembers all their names. And that you once stopped to help clean a spill in the hallway instead of just calling someone." She shrugged. "Old habits." "No," he said. "That's character." For the first time in months, Hesa leaned back on the couch, rested her head on his shoulder, and truly let herself relax. There was no need to prove anything anymore. She hadn't just changed the way people looked at her. She'd changed what people believed was possible. Not by talking about it, but by living it. Every single day.